I am the Maryland liaison for the National Rifle Association Institute for Legislative Action. My testimony today will be interesting because it will be the first time I will be testifying on the nature of a bill which doesn't exist. The bill that is before you, HB 1000, the text of the bill is drafted to the wear and carry permit statute. It is not drafted to the section of the code that deals with either the HQL created by the FSA in 2013 or the general purchase of all firearms, both regulated and unregulated. This bill only says that a person may not get a permit to carry a concealed firearm if you are on the terrorist watch list. It does not do what Delegate Clippinger and his panel said it does. It simply doesn't. It's not drafted to the correct section of code to have that effect. Now, that having been said, it's a banner day for me again, because I find myself for the first time here testifying on the same side of an issue as the editorial boards of the Washington Post, USA Today, Los Angeles Times, and the Boston Globe, in arguing that the terrorist watch list maintained by the National Counterterrorism Center is not an appropriate list to use to deny people their constitutional rights. You cannot deny someone a constitutional right based on their inclusion on a secret government list. The process for being placed on this list is that someone in one of the nominating agencies, which includes FBI, Homeland Security, CIA, Interpol, et cetera, has a reasonable suspicion that you either are involved in or are connected to terrorist activity. That is not even the same standard to be arrested. Perhaps that's the reason why if these people are so dangerous, they're not actually being arrested, because they don't have enough evidence to meet probable cause. Once your name is on that list, which is, by the way, classified, you have no way of finding out that your name is on it. You have no way of finding out if your name is not on it. It is, by the way, a federal crime to attempt to purchase a firearm knowing that you are prohibited. And if I were to decide tomorrow that I wanted to go purchase a new firearm and wanted to make sure that I wasn't on the terror watch list before I made that purchase, and I called up the FBI and I said, hey, am I on the terror watch list? They would laugh at me because you don't tell terrorists they're being investigated. There were a couple of other issues brought up during the previous testimony that I just wanted to add on. The process for redress, should you find out that you're on this list, let's say you're denied boarding on an airplane. If you were denied boarding because you're on the no-fly list, a subset of the greater, much larger terrorist watch list, you would fill out a form with the Transportation Security Administration, which would then be reviewed by executive branch officials, and then reviewed by more executive branch officials. And at some point, and apparently the latest average that I was able to find was 67 days, you would get an answer as to whether or not your inclusion on that list was appropriate or not. Maybe. You might, as in the case of Dr. Rahima Ibrahim, who was not a US citizen, but is a classic example of this list, spend 10 years in federal court attempting to have your name removed from the list and never find out the actual reason why your name was included in the first place, because that information was redacted from all of the available court records. You also, by the way, would not be allowed to attend your own hearings in federal court because you would be denied a visa to enter the US. Other persons of note whose names have been included on both the no-fly list and the terrorist watch list include the Bolivian president, Evo Morales, U.S. Army Colonel and Democratic candidate for Congress Robert Johnson, Senator Ted Kennedy, pop singer Cat Stevens, whose name was then later changed to Yusuf Islam, Representative McClintock, current congressman and former state senator who found out he was on the list when he was in the state legislature. And most interestingly, a person whose name was on the terror watch list until a bill had to be passed to have his name removed from it, Nelson Mandela, was on the terror watch list until 2008, because there was a time when the African National Congress was considered a terrorist organization for their efforts to end apartheid in South Africa. This is not a list that one gets on or off through an adversarial process. And in order to genuinely respect due process, the opportunity to petition for redress must be an adversarial process. In every other instance of a person being denied their constitutional right to own a firearm, they have been through a judicial process. Felons have been convicted through a court proceeding. Persons who have been convicted of misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence have been through a court proceeding. Persons who have been adjudicated, and I'm going to use the federal government term here, I don't particularly like the term myself, but persons who have been adjudicated mentally defective, which is the federal term used in the law, have been through a courtroom process. They have had an opportunity to present evidence in their own defense, and they have had an opportunity to confront their accuser. Being on this list does not include any of those things, nor does the redress process for getting your name off the list. It is an entirely bureaucratic executive branch employee-based process. Final point I have to make is that this list is comprised of names, not identities. Before I got married, if I went to go purchase a firearm, I would get a delay. I did not get a denial, but I got a delay because evidently there is a felon in the state of Florida who has my same first and maiden last name. It was never a really big deal because somebody over at FBI would go, oh, that's not her, no problem. That is not the case for many of the people who find themselves on this list. How many people are named Robert Johnson? There's a hotel right up the street. Ted Kennedy, T. Kennedy. Representative McClintock of US Congress apparently shares the same name as a member of the IRA. It is not a list that includes identifying factors other than your name. Names are shared by many people. Names are misspelled. Names are mistranslated from foreign languages. How many different ways are there to spell Gaddafi? This list is not an appropriate standard to use when you're talking about denying someone a constitutional right. But again, on the nature of the bill that is before you, it requires someone to prove a negative in order to obtain a carry permit. You would have to prove that you are not on the list, which again, I can't call up the FBI and say, hey, am I on the terrorist watch list, and have them go, no, you're fine. In fact, I might get myself put on the watch list for calling to ask to see if I'm on the watch list. It's not appropriate.